Alright, so today I want to cover 10 deadly mistakes that you can avoid when keeping pet snakes or if you're working in a breeding operation. As a matter of fact, I've been breeding ball pythons here for about 5 years, and I had 2 snakes that passed away on me. One of them was just kind of a random anomaly. It's just kind of, you know, keeping a lot of animals. Sometimes animals will just randomly pass away and they just die for some unexpected reason. And you're always hoping when you see that one snake or that one animal die that you don't have something in your collection and it's not going through and you don't really risk anything else. Luckily, I only had that one snake just kind of randomly die. And then there's another one that passed away that I'm going to cover in this video. I'm going to cover 10 deadly mistakes that hopefully you can avoid. Alright, so mistake number 1 is actually using a heat source without a thermostat, using an uncontrolled heat source. As a matter of fact, if you go over to a lot of the reptile forums, this is probably the biggest thing that gets a lot of people. It injures a lot of snake. I've seen a lot of people use heat rocks, and heat rocks actually get too hot for snakes. They can get as hot as 140 degrees, and really you don't really want to go above probably 90, 95 maximum. I pretty much set my hot spots at 90. I don't go above 90 degrees. You kind of want to make sure that the hot spot is controlled with a thermostat, and whether you're using a cheap thermostat or a really expensive one, you definitely want to control that heat source. And a really good way to control it is to actually tape the probe directly to the heat source and kind of dial it in exactly like that. Sometimes, you know, if you actually have the heat source away from the probe, it can actually work, but you have a lot of cycling on and off of your thermostat trying to keep a stable temperature. I think it's always better to actually tape the probe directly to the heat source, and then you have a really stable temperature, and then you can dial up the temperature of the heat source to try to get the inside of the tub or your enclosure at the proper temperature. You always want to make sure too that if you're heating and measuring the temperature, that you measure the temperature on the bottom of the enclosure, not really on top of the substrate, because remember, if the snake actually buries under the substrate and gets right on top of the bottom of the enclosure, it can actually be too hot for that snake. I'd say that's probably one of the biggest things you really have to watch, is controlling your heat source. Alright, so number 2 is probably the biggest thing that kills most snakes, and that is improperly using heat packs in shipping boxes. You have to be really careful. And as a matter of fact, I've seen a lot of people when they're shipping snakes, you know, especially if you go over to like shipyourreptiles.com and it gives you all the conditions and the temperatures and the right types of heat packs. If you're actually improperly using a heat pack, you can actually kill your snake from too hot of a temperature. You have to really use the right heat pack. You have to use the right size shipping box, and you have to make sure there's holes in the shipping box, because remember, if you're using a heat pack in a box, the heat pack normally gets too hot for the snake. So if the snake's directly on the heat pack, it can actually kill it from too much heat. And then if you have a heat pack in there without the proper ventilation, without the holes in the box, it can actually run out of oxygen in there, because the way the heat packs work is they absorb the oxygen to produce heat. So you may have to make sure that the box is properly ventilated. Alright, so the number 3 thing that can kill your snake, and that is feeding before brumation. And brumation is essentially another term for hibernation. A lot of people put certain snakes through hibernation. Luckily, with ball pythons like Bobby around my shoulders here, this snake does not need to go through a brumation. As a matter of fact, you definitely don't want to put ball pythons through any type of a cold cycle before you breed them. But some snakes, like most of your colubrids or king snakes, it's actually beneficial to put them through that cold cycle. And most people will say you want to feed them and then wait a complete month before you put them into that brumation cycle, because if they have a rodent inside their belly and you actually put them into brumation, which is significantly lower temperature, a lot of times it can actually kill them because they can't properly digest the rodents. Alright, so number 4 is probably the one that killed one of my snakes accidentally, and that is having your snake escape losing your snake. As a matter of fact, I lost one of my snakes and I never found it. It's been a couple years and I'm sure that snake didn't survive. It disappeared somewhere. It was actually a really small California king snake, one of the black and white ones. It was super small, super skinny, like, you know, as small as a pencil, really small hatchling, and it's a really awesome snake. I really love the king king snakes, but I actually started in king snakes and I eventually moved over to ball pythons just because there's a better market for ball pythons versus the king snakes. But I'd say you risk really, especially if you can't find your snake, you risk severely injuring or potentially killing your snake if it goes for a prolonged period of time without food, if it actually escapes. All right, so number 5 is running out of water. You definitely don't want your snakes to run out of water. And it's kind of interesting because snakes are almost, it's almost like it's impossible to kill a snake. They are so tough. You know, they used to call them gods because it just kind of blows your mind that how long they can go without food. I can actually put a snake in a tub and leave it there for 6 months without food. As a matter of fact, my longest snake that went without food was 1.5 years without food. It was pretty amazing. And sometimes they just go on really long fasts, especially if they're females in the breeding season. Almost all of them will go off of food for months at a time. But you have to remember they are animals and they still need to drink water. If you run out of water, they don't last very long. You definitely want to make sure that all your snakes have a constant supply of fresh water. All right, so number 6 is actually dangerous for you as a snake handler, and that is if you get into venomous snakes and you're a novice without proper training. So if you're getting into some of the venomous, I would say even some of the rear fang venomous, I would probably get some proper training. I think hognoses are pretty safe, but there's some that are, you know, considered rear fang venomous that are a little bit more severe than a hognose that I'd probably get some training. If you're going for the cobras or the rattlesnakes, I would definitely get some hands-on training from someone who is very familiar with venomous reptiles before you jump into venomous. All right, so number 7 actually only pertains to king snakes, and that is if you house a big king snake with a little king snake. And believe it or not, king snakes will actually eat other snakes if there's a big size difference between them. If you're housing 2 king snakes together, you may want to make sure they're the same size. As a matter of fact, I probably wouldn't do it long term, and when you're breeding, I would probably make sure both of your king snakes are approximately the same size. As a matter of fact, I've heard stories where king snakes will actually eat themselves. They'll actually start eating the tail. As a matter of fact, I've heard stories of that actually happening, which is kind of unfortunate. I think it's very rare that a king snake will actually do that. I've had king snakes. I've never had one do that, but I would definitely avoid putting 2 king snakes together that are completely different sizes. All right, so number 8 is actually, I did kill more than 2 snakes, and that is actually when I was incubating some eggs and I let them dry out too much. You definitely don't want to let your eggs dry out too much, and I actually killed them in the eggs. It's kind of unfortunate. When I first started breeding ball pythons, I was trying a whole bunch of different egg container configurations, and I finally went to the 50-50 vermiculite water by weight with a plastic egg crate on top of it, and then with some press and seal on top without any ventilation holes. But when I first started, I thought, you know, I'd try to control the humidity inside of my incubator and kind of have more of an open egg box, and it just dried out too much. And my initial eggs, when they dry out too much, they'll actually start flattening out more and more until essentially all the liquid in the egg is completely gone, and it just flattens out and they don't properly develop and they die in the egg. So if you're incubating eggs, I would say you probably want 90 to 100% humidity so you don't dry out your eggs. All right, so number 9, one thing you really have to watch, especially if you're feeding live, and that is leaving the rodent in with the snake too long unsupervised. The rodent can actually do some severe damage to the snake. I've seen some pictures on the internet where people accidentally left a rodent with the snake and the rodent tore up the snake. It was an awful sight. You definitely don't want to do that. As a matter of fact, I've had some, you know, you kind of go through your collection and you definitely want to mark all your live feedings and you want to go back with them, I'd say within a couple minutes. As a matter of fact, I'd probably supervise the whole thing. That would be the safest. And pretty much the only time I really leave a rodent in with the snake overnight is if I'm using like really small pinky mice or pinky rats or something like that. Really small juveniles with their eyes still closed. And usually you only have to do that with really small hatchlings. Ball python hatchlings can be extremely difficult to start on food. And usually you can leave them in overnight if they're super small. But that's one thing you really want to stay on top of, is don't leave your rodents with your snakes for a prolonged period of time. All right, so number 10 is actually to protect you as a snake keeper, and that is don't let big snakes wrap around your neck. It can be fatal if you get a big snake that you actually can't pry off from around your neck. I've seen some tragic results from some snake keepers, especially with reticulated pythons, because they're really long and skinny, and you have to really be careful. You know, Bobby, actually I can unpeel Bobby here from my neck. He's squeezed me hard a few times, but he doesn't really have enough strength to permanently put the chokehold on me. You know, he's even tonight he's like kind of wanting to choke me out here. But I'd say probably no bigger than an adult ball python around your neck. You really don't want any of the big snakes ever to wrap around your neck. As a matter of fact, what I like to do with big snakes, I like to kind of put them over my shoulder like this, just kind of over one shoulder. And what I really like to do is take the tail of a big snake and have it wrap around my leg. Essentially what that does, especially with the really big ones like Lucy, who's almost 90 pounds now, she'll actually wrap around my leg and she'll support herself most of her weight. So instead of me lifting an 85, 90 pound snake, she's actually wrapping around my leg and lifting most of that weight, just kind of leveraging on my leg. So it's actually a lot lighter than the weight of the full snake. And it seems like you have a little bit better control on the head and the front part of the snake, so you don't end up with a snake wrapped around your neck. All right, so it is time for the question of the day. And Cameron Bodwell asks, is it normal for a ball python to have a spike on the tip of its tail? And that is a very good question. As a matter of fact, that's the first time I've ever been asked that question. As a matter of fact, Bobby here and most of the ball pythons, they actually do have a pretty sharp tail right on the tip of their tail. If you look at this, it's actually kind of hard and pokey right on the tip of the tail. And the interesting thing is sometimes he'll get like around my neck and under my armpit and kind of poke me with that little thing. It's not really super sharp like it would you know, I don't think it would actually puncture the skin. It's not really that hard, but it's interesting that someone actually noticed the tip of the tail can be pretty pokey. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.